Welcome to Ripstop on the Record, the podcast for makers, by makers, where we talk about all things MYOG. Brought to you by Ripstop by The Roll. I think it's good, right?
Yeah, I think that was a good take.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Ripstop on the Record, episode 102. I'm Jameson.
And I'm Carter.
In this episode, we are talking about 10 sewing tips that you absolutely need to know. We've polled our Instagram followers to ask you about what things you struggle with the most so that we can give you some, hopefully, helpful advice on how to alleviate those issues or mitigate the problems and maybe make you a better sewer, maybe just make your days a little easier. So all of that is to come, but first, a couple of updates as well as welcome back to the mic, my good friend, Carbear.
Hello, I am happy to be here. I am not here against my will, and I'm just kidding. I am really excited to talk about some sewing tips. They are, you can never have enough tips, to be honest. I mean, all our wait staff people out there know that, so.
True, many tips. Yeah, so a couple updates. You have recently onboarded a new product. Can you tell us about the Porter Duffel?
Oh, yeah, lots of exciting products, both about to be live and that have recently gone live. One of those is the Learn MYOG Porter Duffel pattern. So you can, just like any of the patterns that we offer, you can both get just the digital download, or you can get the download and we will print using our printing capabilities onto large format paper so that you'll have the actual pattern. And you don't have to take it to FedEx or wherever and try to. Does FedEx print? I just said a name. Staples, whatever.
Yeah, sweet pattern. Really cool duffel. I think that these are I think this pattern is one of Tim's finest patterns just because it's his latest. Not to say all of them are not fantastic, but we've heard good feedback from other people that have made the duffel. And so yeah, if you're looking to make something new, go check it out. And as always, check out all of Learn MYOG patterns. So the product right before the Porter Duffel was that we just did new colors of RTS DCF. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we have two new colors, specially curated by me. One of them is cranberry, and the other one is sunflower. They're both like really cool colors. That one of the reasons for picking those is that there are shades that have just never existed on Dyneema Composite at all. So one of them is like a magenta-ish, reddish, kind of purplish, depending on the variant color, and then the other one is pretty yellow, like a sunflower. Although sunflowers, yeah, anyways, it's magenta and yeller, pretty much. So we're really excited about those. We are going to have more stock soon. It was so popular that I think two of the variants already sold out. So our team's working really hard to churn out more so that you guys have the opportunity to make the lightest, most vibrant gear that you can.
Yeah. If you want to see pictures of what those colors look like, check it out on Instagram or on the website. There's some in-use shots of different products that were made for the sake of photos. So go check them out there. All right, let's get on to the podcast. Yeah, so like we mentioned in the intro, we're going to go over 10 tips. This episode evolved a little bit from the original conversation we had about it, which Avery, Carter, and I were going to come up with 3 tips of our own, like kind of recommendations. But quickly we realized that I wanted to answer specific questions that people and makers were having troubles with. I think we could provide good tips, but I would rather speak directly to things that people are struggling with than kind of more ambiguous things that I've just been thinking about myself. So we're going to go over a lot of these things. We've broken them up into 10 kind of things that we'll talk about with specific kind of questions in each of them. But first, we do want to go over Carter's tips because they're sort of relevant for everything. So instead of mentioning them 10 times, we'll mention them now.
Yeah, so you guys have probably heard, if you are a listener of the pod, you've heard me talk about some of these things before, but as Jameson mentioned, I want to just say them now so that in every topic, I don't accidentally default back to these 3, because I really think that they are applicable to probably not just sewing, but definitely sewing and making. So firstly, go slow. Or is it slowly? I'm not sure, but you get the point. I notice this a lot, especially in beginner makers, which is kind of strange, honestly, because you would think that whenever you're first starting out, you might be apprehensive about the sewing machine or your fabric. But for whatever reason, when people start out, they really want to go fast. I think it's like the excitement of getting everything going. And so they just like stomp on the pedal, and before you know it, the fabric's going everywhere, and they're like trying to hold on for dear life. In a lot of cases, cottage manufacturers that make phenomenal gear are not just like hammering down on the pedal to make a custom backpack. If you watch any sort of YouTube videos about their making process, you'll see that they're often using like a walking foot sewing machine, and it's going very slowly. So just something to keep in mind if you're feeling overwhelmed or you can't quite figure out why the seam isn't turning out the way you want or it's not as straight as you would like. Just know that it's okay to slow it down a little bit. And I think the same thing goes for any part of making, whether it's taping up the seams or putting on like cutting out the pattern. Taking your time and going slowly will ultimately make whatever you're making better. Secondly, this kind of flows into going slowly, but have a startup checklist. I think this is really important. It's something that I notice even in our expert makers here at the shop.
I don't know who you're talking about.
It seems tedious, but I promise if you have a startup checklist, and yours might look a little, different than others, but fundamentally you're checking for your bobbin and your thread. You're checking the needle to make sure it's not bent. You're making sure that your station is clear and cleaned up as much as you can do so. And you know that you're starting off in the right spot. Everybody's done this. It's terrible. You are excited about a project. You've been patterning it. You're about to start sewing. You get through 4 stitches and you realize the bobbin thread's out. Now you have to stop. You're shifting your momentum from being creative and excited to, okay, now I got to load this thing up and spool up the bobbin. And it's just, then you also have to go back and fix that stitch wherever it was that the thread ran out. So just try to do that. Even if you literally make a checklist, like a spreadsheet that you print out and have near your station, I think it's really important to check those beginning things.
And we will have a startup checklist to go with this episode. So if you want to see it, click on the show notes or go into the episode page on our website. But I'll make a startup checklist PDF for people to download. So if you don't have one, you can use this one as kind of your reference. But yeah, we can make that happen so that you don't have to make one up on your own. But that's something you've been getting me in the practice of doing more often, especially with a makerspace where there are multiple people sewing. It's maybe even more important, but it's a really good practice because you don't know, again, especially in a makerspace where you don't know what's been going on. It's really important that you run a couple of test stitches. You understand where the bobbin's at, how it's threaded, the tension's right, your station's set up. You've been getting me more in the practice of that. And it's not to sound dramatic, but it has saved my projects because I'm not accidentally running 3 stitch lines over a laminate material and having the seam rip 3 times. Yeah,
for sure. Shout out Jason. So for number 3, the final one, and then we can get on to the things that you guys suggested, I promise. Don't be afraid to take a break. This is another one that I've encountered many times. I've talked about this before. I think we've talked about this a few times, but I know it's difficult because really when you're making something, you're so excited to see the finished product and you're proud of what you're making usually, that you don't want to slow down. You're like, no, I'm so close. Well, if you've been sewing for 4 hours and you're starting to get frustrated, or even if you're not, sometimes you can just walk away, come back tomorrow, come back on Saturday, give it some time. You have other things in your life that you can also spend time doing, and it's going to prevent you from making easy mistakes because you're tired, or hard mistakes because you're frustrated and you want to be done. And now you're going to be even more pissed off because you realize that you have to seam rip half of your backpack because you were angrily, chugging along. So it's a hard thing, but remember that you can take a break. Unless you're like, for some reason you're like under duress and being forced to sew for your life, in which case you can't take a break. You should probably just keep going. Yeah, just set the machine down. Hopefully you're not holding your sewing machine, but if you are, that's okay. Set your project aside and spend some time away from the machine. Go do a sit-up or a half a sit-up or something.
Something that's helped me put projects down is setting micro goals. I used to sit down to start making a backpack, and now I've thought about just make the back panel, make the front pocket, make one shoulder strap, sort of set these smaller goals, set your goals. And at least for me, again, I was starting making, it was I want to make a backpack now. And I was always frustrated or rushed trying to finish that goal. And it helped me mentally just be okay, I'm going to make a back panel. I could be successful at that. So for an hour or two and not be gone for 7 hours on a Saturday or something.
For sure.
Cool.
So,
great tips.
Those are my tips. I'll try not to repeat them. If I do, it's just because they're important and you should hear it again. And so should I.
All right, tip number one that we got asked about probably the most from people, but also something that I know from personal experience and from other conversations that it can be really difficult for people are sewing circles. Specifically, what happens when someone is making circles or trying to sew a circle for the first time is that you often get a lot of puckering, or you get something that doesn't really resemble a circle at all. It kind of looks like a drunk hexagon or something.
The old drunk hexagon. Run into those a lot.
Tales old as time. So as someone who has struggled with circles quite a bit, I made the first note under this. I have a couple tips for sewing with circles. One of them, you don't actually have to sew a circle. I know it sounds dumb when the whole point is about circles, but I would actually recommend thinking about it as a bunch of straight lines. So one thing you can do, this could be harder to cut sometimes depending on what sort of cutting situation you have, but you can cut an octagon. You can cut straight sides, and when you turn it out, it's going to look like a circle. So you don't always have to cut it perfectly on a circle. So that's probably my first tip is try actually just doing straight lines. It could end up being quite a bit easier. Another tip that I would have is you use that same mindset of sewing a bunch of straight lines to make a circle. What I always do when I am sewing a circle now is I go roughly 3 stitches and then pivot about 1 degree every time. 1 degree is not the most scientific way, but I won't try to make a perfect turn all the way. I'm going to go 3 stitches straight and then pivot a little bit, kind of keep arcing around like that. I've run into some problems personally when I've been trying to get this perfect arc of sewing and I'm moving the sewing machine and the pattern all around at the same time, and I'm like getting this perfect circle. That's when I normally end up running off of the bottom panel, or I kind of run stitches on the side, and I don't end up with my correct seam allowance and things like that. So yeah, those would be my first two. Think about a circle as a lot of little straight lines, and for me that was a lot easier to wrap my head around, so I wasn't trying to perfect like that my hand and foot and eye movement to like get everything to line up, but just go small straight lines to make your circle.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the most important. The only other thing I would suggest is, depending on your pattern, use pins, use clips, use basting tape, use any of those things that will hold the circle in place to your advantage. Of course, there are times where that's not applicable and you need the pattern piece to be free, in which case I was going to say go slowly. See, I'm already breaking my rule. But yeah, if you can, use the tools that you have available, like pins or clips, and it will help you a lot.
The other thing that I would say, my second tip, is if you're making your own patterns or trying to make your own project that doesn't have predetermined lengths and whatnot, be specific about your math. I'm normally a math generalist with my patterning. I'm like, oh, it's going to be about this size, I'll figure it out. With circles, well, with non-circle pattern pieces, you can be kind of I can kind of fudge it and it'll work out fine. I can take things off. I'm good enough at working that out. But when working with circles, you really need to be very specific. What I mean by being math specific is like if you're making a chalk bag and you have a 5-inch, the circle on the bottom is a 5-inch circle and you're basing everything off of that, then you need to know exactly what your seam allowance is. Do 5 times 3.14 plus 1/2 inch. Just measure that out specifically. That will alleviate a lot of pressure. One question that somebody asked was, how do I not get puckering when I'm sewing with circles? Puckering typically comes from having a pattern piece that is not fitted appropriately for the thing you're trying to sew it onto, where you end up folding or moving around. If you use the tips that Carter mentioned earlier, and if you're going to think about it sewing as like a million little straight lines, and the pattern pieces are the right size, then there's almost no way that you'll get puckering. Typically, you'll get that when one of the pieces is misshapen. So either cut it specifically or make sure your math is right if you're making a pattern on your own.
Love it.
All right, so tip number 2 is binding. Binding is a phenomenal way to finish a raw edge, add some more stability, and kind of protect that seam. But it can be really hard because you end up having to sew on quite a lot of layers, or it can be just difficult. So what are some of your tips for binding, Carter?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot because there are a lot of situations, but we'll try to hit some of the highlights here. Having a binding attachment that is quality and that works with your machine and that you're familiar with is the number one tip, if that can even be a tip. It's like having, especially if you have an industrial machine, you can get binding attachments that make binding so incredibly easy that you wouldn't believe, you would not believe how wonderful it is to be able to put together a tarp, an entire hammock tarp, 12 feet long, in 15 minutes because it's so good. Now, I recognize that not everyone can have that. So if you're needing to bind something by hand, then I think you really want to pay attention to the binding tape that you're using, whether that's grosgrain or webbing or a herringbone tape, the first thing that you should do is make sure that the binding tape that you have, the width of that tape when folded in half, is going to cover up your raw edge and your seam allowance. So, I mean, that doesn't mean get a 4-inch piece of grosgrain and fold it over half your project, but I have found before that not paying attention to that and just kind of starting, and then you realize, oh, well, I kind of just like missed the grosgrain on the back side completely because I was running so close to the edge that it was just very hard to keep everything stable.
A personal rule of thumb that I kind of use is I use 5/8 grosgrain and 1-inch grosgrain, and I use 5/8 for just about everything, and then 1-inch when I'm like 1-inch grosgrain to cover seams where I have like spacer mesh and foam and like other thicker items. Just for people listening, like those are kind of the two that I always use: 1-inch for the thicker stuff, 5/8 for everything else.
Yeah, and then like also another simple tip is like pre-folding the grosgrain in half and kind of getting the memory started. If you're binding something small, you can actually just cut the grosgrain or the binding tape to the size that you need and go ahead and pin it or clip it on to the project. And that's going to be the easiest way. You know that it's folded completely in half and that it's even and it's going to feed evenly. So if you can do that and you need to do that, that's great. If you can't, then going ahead and starting the binding in the machine and sewing down a few stitches so that it's folded in half, and you can use your right hand that's not manipulating your project to kind of keep it folded in half. Take it slowly in segments and check the front and back. The worst thing you can do is not check and just like keep going and assume that you've hit both sides of the grosgrain and captured the fabric, and then you flip it over and you've sewn another line of stitching just onto your project. It's happened to me lots of times.
Yeah.
This one's going to be hard to give a tip for, but I think a lot of people ask this is like, how do I bind something that has a curved edge? Use the tips that I just said before, but I mean, honestly, doing it without a binding attachment of any kind is going to be really difficult. And all I can say is that you should also follow the tips that we just talked about in sewing circles and pretty much apply that to binding on curved edges, because it's just going to take a lot of manipulation of the grosgrain and slightly turning the pattern piece and making sure that everything's laying down evenly. And yeah, I highly recommend, if you're going to be doing that a lot, that you find some sort of attachment that works for your machine, especially a right angle binding attachment, because it allows you to sew on curves instead of it just being straight. The binding tape comes in from the side. That's what we use here, and it's really nice. So
a quick tip on clipping: if you're gonna pre-cut your grosgrain or your binding and then clip that on, one thing that I often do when I'm clipping on grosgrain specifically is I flip the Wonder Clip around. So the clips that we have in the makerspace are red on one side and white on the other. They make them in blue and green and other colors, but the red side is curved and the white side is flat. That curved side, sometimes with a shorter grosgrain, it's not going to clip the grosgrain down entirely. It'll kind of let it billow. I'll flip the Wonder Clip around so the flat side is on top, and that does a better job of keeping the grosgrain folded in half in the right place and keeping it there. I don't know if that makes sense, but just try flipping the Wonder Clip around so the flat side is, you get more contact area between the grosgrain and the material. I've just found personally. All right, tip number 3, a huge technique for anybody who's sewing with zippers, whether you're making packs, travel accessories, bags, whatever it is, knowing how to get a really good zipper quality is extremely important. So that's something we got asked a lot about, but something that we were going to talk about anyway. But getting a good result with zippers, I think it has a lot to do with seam allowance and has a lot to do with kind of having a template in your mind for how you want to line things up. Most sewing machines have different presser feet. And I think, or they have a needle that can move, and they're not the same thing, but in this instance, they sort of have the same result. I would say have something in mind for how you want your needle and your presser foot to line up based on the zipper that you have. So here at least I use a lot of number 3 and number 5 YKK zipper. And with those, I have I know in my mind where I want to line up the presser foot for those. So for number 3, because the zipper tape is much narrower, I'm going to put the smaller presser foot on, and I'm going to line up the right side of the foot with the edge of the tape. that's going to put the stitch roughly right down the middle of the tape. And that's kind of where I want the stitch to end up, is right in the middle. It's not closer to the teeth and it's not closer to the edge. I kind of want it right in the middle. So that way, when I flip it out, I can run a top stitch. And I'll talk about that in a second. With number 5, I'm going to leave the wider presser foot on and line up the presser foot on the edge of the teeth. Because the tape is so much thicker with number 5, I typically don't want there to be a lot of tape, where I found that if I line it up still kind of close to the middle, then I'm going to keep my seam allowance fairly close to the same. Because what you don't want to happen is, if you're making, let's say you're going to make a ZPK or zipper pouch kit, if you sew the stitch really close to the edge of the tape, far away from the teeth, then that is increasing the size of your project some, because the amount of zipper tape is more than the amount of fabric that's folded under. I'm shooting for my stitch, the first stitch where you're basting on the zipper with the upside down before you top stitch it. That one, I'm shooting for that to be straight in the middle. Do you do something similar, or do you line up closer to the teeth or further away from the teeth? What's your preference?
No, I think it really depends, but you're definitely right about, if you don't want to increase the size of your project, or if you have specific, if you have specific aesthetics that you're looking for in terms of how far away your top stitch is from the teeth, then just keep that in mind and place whether you're using a zipper foot or moving your needle or both, just make sure that you're selecting the correct beginning seam allowance to have the outcome that you want.
So another thing that kind of depends, this kind of goes back to seam allowance, is for some of the projects where I'm looking for a really polished and professional look, I will bind over the raw edge of the zipper. So I'll base the zipper on, then I'll bind it, then I'll flip it and top stitch. For that one, you're going to need enough seam allowance to do that binding. So that's another time where I'm especially going to make sure that stitch is on the center, or maybe closer to the zipper teeth even, to make sure I have space to do that binding, and then run the top stitch. For the top stitch specifically, I'm going to line up the fold of the material with the edge of my presser foot, and that's going to be that line. It's, probably about 1 centimeter from the fold to the stitch. Something I've been kind of working on, actually. You pointed out a while ago that my stitch is often really close to the fold, and what that ends up is kind of the zipper flap, making a flap on the inside of the project a bit more. So I've been really working on kind of pushing that stitch out a bit more, so that it's really closing that flap, so it's not flapping on the inside. Just use the word flap too much, but you got what I was saying.
Flap, 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 flap. There you go.
Thank you. Also, just because we're talking about zippers, it's a good time to shout out our colored zipper. If you haven't already seen, our number 3 zipper now comes in several colors. There's Cardi brown, orange, blue, neon green or neon yellow,
and
olive green. Yeah, there's a lot of sweet colors. I've been using that a lot. You can mix and match the colors too, because it's all number 3. So I've made some that have like olive green with neon green, kind of staggering each other. There's also matching zipper sliders, kind of a sales pitch, but it's really cool. So I definitely recommend checking it out. All right. Tip number 4 is something I'm really bad at. So I'm going to ask you for tips here. Hemming.
Yeah, this is another one that obviously we want to give you some tips that are useful, but I can't, unfortunately, maybe I'll be for hire someday. I can't sit down with you at your machine and help you physically do a rolled hem. But fundamentally, I think it's really the best thing to do here. And I'm sorry that it's kind of repeated, but it just is what it is. Unless you're really skilled and you really are used to doing rolled hems, you're making hammocks all the time, so you're doing a double fold a lot, just clip it down. Measure your seam allowance using a seam gauge, figure out the hem that you want, and clip it down, even if it takes a while. That way the hem's not moving and you can focus on lining up the presser foot or the seam allowance where you want it and just plugging away. I think that's the number one thing. Just like the other tips, I also think that for doing a hem, it's important to take it, really break it up into segments. So whatever that is, however the size of your project, that might look differently. Obviously, you're not going to break up a 3-inch rolled hem into 1-inch sections. That might be a little foolish. But if you're doing a larger project, it's a really good idea to lay down 6 to 12 inches of stitching and then stop for a second, check everything, readjust if you need to, and take it that way, rather than looking at the seam as one big long seam. It'll help you catch mistakes. It'll help you catch if your bobbin runs out. It'll help you stop right before you're about to, lose the fold. And it also gives you an opportunity to measure that hem and make sure that it's still at the size that you want. I definitely see that quite a bit where someone's like, okay, I want to do a 1-inch rolled hem. Starts out great. You're plugging away, doing your best. And then, especially if you haven't clipped anything down, by the time you're done, the seam is actually like 3/4 of an inch or less. And now it looks really wonky because you've almost created like this cone that goes down. But yeah, that's my number one tip. Use clips and break it into segments.
I have 2 tips for hemming. We have some really inexpensive materials. They're not bad materials. They just happen to be priced really well. If you're a hobbyist DIYer and you want to do MYOG, you have some projects in mind that you take seriously, then I don't think we talk about this enough, but like it's totally okay to practice. I would recommend going to listen to episode, I think it was 99 with Rob from Z-Packs. He trains their sewing machine operators, but he mentioned some really cool techniques about how to improve your sewing. And it got me thinking a lot about actually practicing some techniques. So I mentioned some of our inexpensive fabrics because frankly, I would go buy a yard of Sil Poly, go buy a yard of Hyper D300. These are materials that are like under $8 a yard that you can just rip apart because it is really helpful to practice. So I mean, if you're going to be making a tarp and you're going to be doing large amounts of rolled hems and you're not super confident in that, then spend an extra like $8 to get a yard that you can just practice roll hemming on. You can rip that in different strips. It's totally okay to do that. There's no shame in using some fabrics to really dial in what it is that you're doing because you'll get a better result later on. The other thing that I've heard people do, I can't say that I actually know this from personal experience, but if you are hemming on the fly while you're sewing, then you can mark out on your finger with like marker or pen or something. You can mark out like a 1/2 inch, like whatever your rolled hem is, and then kind of hold that up. So when you do your double fold, you can see the width and make sure that it's roughly the right. You kind of hold your finger on top of the hem, and you can see exactly, oh, that is a 1/2 inch, that is a 1/4 inch. That gives you some frame of reference. That's assuming that you have some technique already down, that you're comfortable enough kind of doing a rolled hem while you're going along, but that at least gives you a reference. It's kind of like a seam guide where you can just kind of look like, yep, that's correct. I mean, there's if you listen to an episode of Taylor Weldon, like he has like a rulers tattooed across his hands. It's kind of the same idea. You don't have to tattoo yourself. You can just do marker, whenever you sew, but it's an easy way for reference.
Yeah, another thing that you can do that's similar to that is figure out where your seam allowance, like how large you want it to be, and you can take a piece of tape and tape all the way across the bed of your machine so that you have a sight line that you're watching. That can just help you get straighter stitches on hems.
Tip number 5, corners. This is also something I'm not that great at. I don't know if you've noticed, but my corner's never that crisp. And I have a question. I guess I have a question directly. Someone else put this in. I didn't ask, but I'm going to start it out. Whenever I'm like, so say I'm sewing a backpack and I'm sewing the back panel to like the side panels, I never know if I should, so there's three panels there. There's the bottom, the back, and the side. So there's the corner, right? That corner there. When I'm sewing that, I never know if I should be sewing all the way through the seam or if I should stop all the stitches at the seam allowance point.
You could do either one. I tend to, if I can, I don't know if this is right or not. This is just what I do is I sew through the seam, but I do that for every single pattern piece so that you're ultimately creating that last stitch will create a new corner.
I see. So they all line up. Yeah,
Yes.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yes. Another thing, I mean, this is another one that it's a little bit difficult to give tips on, but things I can think of are, if you can, if your project has a lot of corners and the material that you're using allows for this, you can shorten your stitch length a little bit so that you have more maneuverability. Obviously, the longer stitch length that you have, the harder it's going to be to, if you do need to like actually take a right angle turn, it's going to be very hard if your stitch length is long, because the chances that you can land really close to the spot that you need to take the right angle it's much more difficult to do that if it's long. The other thing that you can do when you get to corners is, anticipate that they're going to be there and stop for a second and use the the flywheel on your machine and turn it by hand to get to the spot that you need to get to if it's a precise area, rather than just pressing down on the presser foot and hoping that it lands where you need it to. That's what I would recommend. And if you have to move the fabric a little bit to make sure that you get it to stop right on the corner, you can do that.
I've also found for some of my corners, it's not that I've sewed them poorly, but I just don't end up pressing them out either. Like they look a lot more crisp if you actually take the time to like reach your hand deep inside a bag and like poke it out versus just like normally I pull it inside out, which we all joke around here that I'm not really good at flipping projects inside out. Like I'm too delicate.
You're terrible at it. It's awful to watch.
I pull them inside out, but then I don't take the time to like individually press and intentionally like work out all the, all the kinks in the project so that it looks nice. I just kind of like flip it inside. I'm like, look, it's a pack. But yeah, if you just take some time to like Avery uses a chopstick, I think, to poke things out, which is good.
I use scissors, but I would, be careful, but I've just always used scissors I even did that on the first thing I ever sewed.
Really?
Yeah, because I showed my mom and she was like, how'd you know to push out the corners? And I was like, I don't know. It just seemed like that makes sense. And like, she got all emotional and was like, you have the spirit of your grandmother. And that part was a little weird, but yeah. Anyways, I've just always used scissors, but same premise, something that can separate the seam and like push out those corners and make it look nice from the outside. Even if you didn't sew the corner completely crisply, that doing that will help it look better. Unless it's really bad, and then maybe push it in a little bit.
This is something I probably should have mentioned when you mentioned your first 3 tips, but I do think something I've found myself saying a lot is seam allowance. Like my corners have gotten better when I got a more specific seam allowance. Like if your seam allowances aren't lining up and one panel's a 1/4 inch off from the other, your corner might be a bit wonky because the whole project's just not measured well, which has been my problem. Tip number 6. This kind of has to do with corners, so it blends nicely. Just sewing with multiple layers. I think I'd like to break this up. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'd like to break this up in a couple of different ways. So let's talk about really lightweight fabrics first, or really slippery fabrics that tend to move around a lot. What would you say for sewing multiple layers of that? Maybe like a tarp or a quilt or something like that.
I'm trying to think of unique tips, but it just gets difficult. Yeah, I mean, pinning those layers together, sticking them together in some way, and let's say it a different way. Arranging your pattern pieces carefully and making sure that whether you're using pins or you're using reference marks so that you can line them up, some way to, like, at the beginning, you just need to start out with them in the right spot. If you start out with them not, they're moving around a little bit, you haven't prepared, then the chances that they're going to slip or pucker or not line up is like way higher.
We made a video about lightweight fabrics a while ago, and one thing that you can do, some people don't like this, and you can be the judge on your own. But with really lightweight fabrics, some people put like a piece of paper behind to help give some structure when feeding it through. The obvious concern there is that you are adding a layer in, like you're changing your thread tension some, you need to rip that paper out in some way. There are limitations there. That's something that some people do. Another tip I'm going to give that's kind of dangerous, but hear me out, is when sewing with really lightweight fabrics, you need to provide some of the stability on the material to help it feed through correctly. Think about when you're sewing X-Pack, that material has a lot of stiffness, so you don't have to provide that stiffness when it's moving through the machine. With a lightweight fabric, you do have to tension the material some to help feed it. The reason that's dangerous is that you cannot and should not pull your fabric like out on the back of the machine or pull it forward. That will mess up your tension. That will cause problems. So you need to provide tension. So like pull the material, but you're pulling it so that it's taut. You're not pulling it or you're not pushing it through or pulling it out, which is the dangerous part. Just make sure you're not trying to manually like pull the stitches through. You're just trying to create tension so the material is not as saggy.
Yeah, for heavier weight materials, the most obvious tip here is if you can get a walking foot machine, if you're doing it a lot, or a walking foot attachment, it's the best thing ever to keep those layers together because you get so much added friction and feeding power. If you don't know what a walking foot is, it's basically, your sewing machine works by using feed dogs, which move back and forth or in a rotational pattern that moves the fabric through the machine. Well, with a walking foot, the presser foot that's normally static on your machine also moves in the same pattern as the feed dog. So you're getting the same feed from the bottom and the top. So if you have 2 layers, they're now being pushed together instead of the top layer not getting the same love that the bottom one does on a regular sewing machine.
Somebody asked about working with insulation on something with multiple layers. And first of all, I just want to recognize that is really difficult to do. I've made a couple different quilts and like quilt iteration stuff, and it's it's something that I've had a lot of troubles with as well. So first of all, you're totally not alone. Second of all, one tip that I would make, so I'll get to Climate Shield insulation in a minute, but when you're working with multiple layers, and one of the outer layer is something that's really stretchy, like Power Grid or an Alpha Direct, and you have another layer of something that's more static, say a Sil Poly or a Mem 15, something like that, you can get the materials, even if you cut them at the same width, they can appear to be different lengths by the time you've run that stitch. For example, recently I made an Alpha Direct bag liner. So it's an Alpha Direct inside with, I think it's actually like a Mem 7 outside. It's like a summer quilt, super compressed. It's kind of light, but just really packs up really tight, which is why I made it and I really liked it. What happened when I was making that is I was sewing the Polartec Alpha Direct 4004, which is a lighter weight version, really stretchy, to the Mem 7. I cut them at the same size, the two panels, but when I sewed it down, the Alpha Direct was like 2 inches longer. You get some natural elongation when you're doing that of that stretchier material. So my recommendation for that is I would do a short side. So one of the short ends first. If you think about like a quilt, you're going to, say it's 50 inches wide at the top and it's 70 inches wide. The 50-inch one, do that first and then go down both sides. So that way you end up with an equal stretch at the bottom, if you will. So I ended up doing both sides. So it kind of stretched like 2 inches down. I could cut that 2 inches off and then sew across the bottom. If you sew around in a big circle, what ends up happening is you end up with this huge crease or like a dart almost all into one corner. And it's really funky. So that's with like a stretchy material and a static material. As for Climate Shield, that can be really tough because you can get the Climate Shield, like the different strands kind of stuck. For those in focus here, for those listening, every so often the camera goes out of focus and I have to like put my hand in front to get it, but it always looks like I'm worshiping.
And because you're the light, like the light shines off your hand when you raise it, it looks like the heavens are opening up.
So yeah, working with Climate Shield though, that can be particularly tough because the Climate Shield strands sort of like get stuck in the presser foot and whatnot. So you have a lot more experience with quilts than I do, Carter. So what would you say? How do you sew Climate Shield with good results?
It is difficult. I would say experiment with your layering. There's a few different ways. You can sew with the Climate Shield on the top or on the bottom, depending on your machine and the space that you have, or just like how you like to sew. It could be that you fare a lot better with it on the bottom than the top, or on the top than the bottom. So try out both of those if you're having trouble with some scraps before you get going. Another thing that you can do is play around with your presser foot tension a little bit. If your presser foot tension is all the way up, that means that you're putting more pressure down on the material. You might need a little bit less so that you can feed it through easier, or in some cases, which kind of bleeds into working with stretchy and slippery fabrics, which are our two tips coming up. It can also help if you loosen that a little bit. It can help you to allow for like less of that. What did you call it? Like when you get all the stretch accumulated into one spot, like the big old
like floppy, a dart flap,
the big old floppy boy that happens. It can help with that. I'm trying to think if there's any other tips. I don't know. Go slowly. Use clips. Yeah, I mean that one honestly is it's a difficult thing to sew with that material.
Yeah.
If you're doing it, if you have the opportunity to have some scraps, then definitely kind of tweaking everything and dialing things in for that specific task will help you a lot.
So we're going to blend 7 and 8. What's working with stretchy fabrics and working with slippery fabrics. Let's start with stretchy fabrics. Carter, somebody specifically asked about finishing and let's talk about finishing stretchy fabrics. So just run over the kind of the primary methods of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, so you can finish stretchy fabrics in the same way that you finish any other fabric, except for the most part, you're going to want to use a stretch stitch, meaning usually a zigzag. So you can get away with not doing that. I don't like that. I think that if you're putting stretch into unless your purpose is to have the stretch but then eliminate it at certain spots, then okay. But for the most part, you want the seam to be able to stretch with the stretch of the fabric that you're using. So that means using a zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch or something like that, as well as the binding that you're going to use. So if you're going to bind, let's say you have a big stretch pocket on your backpack. If you want to bind that, you totally can. You just need to use an elastic binding, like flat elastic, fold over elastic, something like that has the same characteristics that the base fabric you're using does. Or no, actually, there's no or. You should just do that. I found that it looks nice and it just makes the project. It can really be annoying to design something that's like a stretch pocket that's supposed to fit a water bottle or something, and then you decide, hey, I'll just run a straight stitch here with a really small seam allowance, and it'll probably be enough. If that's the way that you want to do it, that's totally okay, and you should make it the way that you want. But if your goal is to have the fabric function the same way it was before you sewed it, then you need to match that stretch.
A lot of people do a rolled hem, like Carter mentioned. Also, we have pre-folded flat elastic around here now, so you can do a pre-folded flat elastic over the raw edge. Because we have a serger in house, something I've been sort of testing out recently I use our Venom stretch mesh a lot. I'll serge the edge, do one fold, and then zigzag stitch over that. Just saves a little bit of material. It's really because I like to test stuff out and see what works. I don't think it's better than a rolled hem. I think a rolled hem is probably like the most protective method, or the flat elastic. But yeah, that's kind of that. In terms of other methods of working with stretchy fabrics, one thing I would mention is the tip that you just talked about with working with insulation. If I can, I might put the stretchy fabric on the bottom with like a pack material on top when I'm going through the sewing machine. Because what happens, a problem a lot of people get with stretchy materials, that if say you're sewing on a water bottle pocket to a side panel of a backpack, the stretchy material is going to be on top, and the X-Pack, Eco-Pack, whatever is going to be on the bottom of that pack material. When you go through, the stretchy material that's on the top is going to stretch some over time as it's going through the presser foot, and it's going to end up being in the wrong place, or the panels don't line up in a weird way, and it kind of makes the project a little bit wonky sometimes, and it can be hard to work out. The stretch material is sort of catching on the presser foot and getting pushed around some. You can alleviate that by just flipping it around with the static material on top. You won't get any of that pull, so it won't have that issue. So try flipping it around. Clipping it's really important. But also what I do is just another way you can alleviate that is just every couple stitches, just raising your presser foot. Think about it like if it's just the presser foot is keeping constant pressure on the stretchy material, which is stretching it out over time. It's just kind of like sitting on top of it and just stretching it over the course of that whole stitch. You can alleviate that pull by just raising the presser foot and putting it back down and keep sewing, so it's not stretching any longer. You're just trying to stop it from just pulling the material through like that. So yeah, it's a couple things there.
Yeah, I think the same thing with slippery fabrics. A lot of you combine what we've talked about with some of the tips for insulation and stretchy fabrics. It's the same for slippery fabrics as well, in the sense that you're fundamentally just trying to counteract, obviously, the slipperiness by either pinning things in place or taking it slow. Specifically, someone was asking about how to avoid the machine eating your material. I don't know that necessarily happens with slippery fabrics as much as it happens with like really ultralight fabrics. James had mentioned earlier that you could put some tissue paper behind the pattern piece that you're working on. I've never done that. I don't like it. But what I will say is that adjusting that presser foot tension and also using the correct needle and thread size for something that's ultralight is a big help, including the throat plate. Some machines, not all of them, but some of them have interchangeable throat plates where on a regular home machine, you have like basically a slot opening because it needs to be larger because there are like 30 stitches on your machine that the needle might move left and right for zigzag and stuff like that. Sometimes they have straight stitch throat plates where it's just a single hole instead of that slot. So you're less likely to have the fabric get pushed through like into the machine because it's such a small hole. If you don't have that, that's totally fine. It's not as common nowadays. But if you're using like an ultralight material, making sure you have a sharp needle, a fresh sharp needle, and making sure you don't have a massive needle and massive thread that's too big for what you're working on will help a lot.
Change your needle.
Change it.
So
right now.
Quick reminder to make sure
stop listening. Don't leave, but stop listening. Pause for a second and go change that needle. It'll be worth it.
Fun fact, I'm just going to tease it. We may be getting more thread in soon, so you can get that from us. But there's also thread and needle recommendations in the specs tab of all of our product pages. So in general, your generic machine needles will work for like the great majority of fabrics that we have. But if you are working with like a MEM 7 or something, then make sure you get a smaller thread needle. Also, one other tip, if you are working with an ultralight laminate material, say 0.51, 0.67, 0.8 DCF, you can use double-sided tape to base those things together as well. So like if you're making a shelter out of 0.8, let's say, you can use a double-sided tape to create that hem for you or create that seam for you and then stitch over that. That keeps them it keeps those two materials together so they can't slip at all. Obviously not an option with something like a membrane steel poly, but a lot of people are making DCF shelters. That's a good way. All right, we're rolling on through here to tip number 9, tips on dialing in your stitches. I just want to normalize us practicing and get like having some scrap material to do this. So for the most part, thanks to Carter's advice, and this is going to be part of your pre-start checklist, is I get a scrap of the material that I'm about to sew with. I try to mimic the stitch I'm about to run, and I just run some stitches on that thing. Currently, I'm working on a bike bag that's made out of coyote tan. Shout out that color. And I have just like 6 by 8 inch material on the table next to the machine that is just for running stitches, where every time I go sit down, I'm just running some. I'm folding it over multiple times to make sure I'm mimicking that. I might throw an extra layer of something else in there just to mimic a zipper tape or something like that. But I'm sitting down and I'm checking to make sure the stitch looks good. Now, some things you're going to look for if you're a really beginner. If you can see the head of the stitch coming up underneath, that's a sign that it may be too tight or too loose. What I mean by the head is you just want to see flat stitches. You don't want to see loops. You just want to see the straight stitch going down on both sides. If you're starting to get some nesting, then this is where your pre-check checklist, again, pre-sew checklist, whatever, this comes into play, because 90% of the time, shout out Aaron, he was on episode like 20. He's a sewing machine mechanic or technician. TNT. So many of your issues are going to come from thread, needle, and tension. Make sure it's threaded correctly from the beginning. Start from the spool, run it all the way through. Make sure it's threaded. Your needle, make sure it's fresh, make sure it's sharp, make sure it's the right size, and then make sure your bobbin tension is good. Make sure you have your bobbin wound appropriately. That's going to alleviate so many of your issues just by checking those things.
Yeah, one tip I would give is make small adjustments. I've taught a lot of people how to sew, especially at this company. So like Jameson, I've worked with him a lot. So I have a pretty good idea of how people react whenever their project starts to go awry and it's related to the needle and thread. And for the most part, they freak out, and that's okay. I've also freaked out, but take it slowly and digest the problem one piece at a time so that you don't exacerbate the issue. And what I mean by that is, let's say you are sewing and you start to see those loops. Okay. Don't turn the tension dial 5 turns and say, oh, well, it was loose. Now I fixed it, because it could be that your bobbin was just running out and that's why the tension's loose. But now you've turned your tension and changed it, and you have another variable that even if you finally figured out that you need to refill your bobbin, now your tension is off and you need to redial it in. So the first thing that I would do if I had like some sort of problem with the stitch is basically go back over that checklist and make small adjustments. So, and the other thing I'll say is that for the most part, you shouldn't be having to adjust your bobbin tension really ever. Maybe over time, just if vibration and stuff causes the spring. I'm more so talking about industrial machines. You might have to adjust that a little more, but unless you're just going from sewing like 0.51 DCF to like 14 backpack straps, you really shouldn't be adjusting that. And it can be a finicky thing to get right. So I would recommend doing all other things before deciding to mess with your bobbin tension.
One thing I'd say with bobbin tension is I think the problem that I've seen happen the most with myself is that I wouldn't pay attention to how it was wound, and that was messing up the tension. So I guess it's like less bobbin, because there's 2 different kinds of bobbin tension, if you will. Like with industrial machines, the bobbin feeds into this thing, and that has a spring, and that kind of changes the difficulty of how the pull, as like pulling a thread, how much it takes. For most people, like you can't change that. Like the bobbin is going inside like a drop-in case, something like that in a home machine. So just pay attention to how the bobbin is wound when you're like, if you're trying to wind a bobbin, say it's on a home machine where you put on the top and you slide it over and then you click it, make sure that thread is catching. So like feed the thread through the hole in the top, hold that up and let it wind tightly, because if you just kind of let it go and it's loose, you'll get to the end and it's always going to get messed up. So that's a popular bobbin tension issue I feel like I see, is that you just don't pay attention to how it's wound, and it kind of gets wound janky, and then you never catch it. You're like, oh, it looks good enough, and it's fine.
Yeah, I think that for whatever reason, people just often think that their bobbin tension is off, and I think it's because it's confusing. It's like the least easy thing to adjust. That and like machine timing. Like someone might call me into the makerspace and say, hey, I think the timing's off. Like the chances of the timing being like, something bad usually has to happen for the timing to be off. Like you would know because you snap the needle in half and it flew across the room and the machine stopped moving. Timing is fundamentally is how all the pieces move together so that the needle can go through a small space in the bobbin case or in the rotary hook so that everything works and the needle goes down and comes back up. If those parts are loose or get out of sync or aren't set up and then tightened correctly, what you can get is that the bobbin is moving out of sync, or the needle is moving out of sync with the bobbin, and it'll hit the bobbin case and stop. So I wouldn't worry. Dialing in your machine, you don't have to worry about that stuff for the most part. Just another small tip. If you see, for the most part, if you see looping of thread or something weird on the back side of your stitch, it's the top tension. I think that's another reason why people often think it's their bobbin tension, because they think, oh, well, the back side, the bottom of my stitch looks bad, and the bobbin starts with B, and it's on the bottom. So, yeah, to make small adjustments and don't make drastic changes or, like, go crazy. Follow your checklist if something goes awry and go from there. Definitely, Jameson brought up a good point. Threading, making sure that your machine is threaded correctly that just happens all the time. That happens here all the time.
Yeah. Where
someone's like, man, I cannot figure out why this is not working. And if you go back and look, somehow, like, I don't know, some sort of rodent came in and like slightly moved the thread. I don't know what happens. And then you make that one small adjustment and get it back into one of the tension discs, and because it had slipped out, and now it's perfect.
If you have a complex machine, last tip before we move on, take a picture of it threaded correctly. That's what I did with our industrial machine a couple of years ago, because I didn't memorize all the little loops and things that it has to go around. So I let Carter thread it. I took a picture of it, and then I just referenced that in the future. If you have something that's complex in any way, just take a picture of it done right, watch a YouTube video, refer to your manual, just have a frame of reference you can always go back to, so that way you're not like, yeah, it looks good to me, everything's done right, and there's just one little thing. We talk about this a lot. For some reason, sewing machines are really simple machines, but they also can be incredibly difficult to diagnose sometimes. When you're looking at 8 different variables, it can be really hard to identify the one thing that is difficult. And that's why Carter's mentioning, like, be methodical about how you go about dissecting it, but take a step back and like look at it in a balanced headspace, because it's between the threading it, the bobbin, the needle, your tension dials, the material you're using. There's a lot of things that you can easily get wrong and get sidetracked by, when often it's really basic stuff that we end up realizing we're like, oh, that was foolish for me to forget. It's foolish just because we don't normally use our most intentional head. All right, the last and final tip is kind of a fun one. I really like that somebody asked this. I got a question, I think it was on YouTube, about how to add a lining to a tote bag. And I really like lining projects. Obviously, it's not an ultralight thing, but it can be really cool for backpacks and tote bags and more like everyday carry and like style items. So let's first start with how to line a tote bag with our kit, because that was a question somebody asked, but then we can talk about some other lining stuff after.
Well, I'm not like I didn't go to college for like sewing. So
Same.
I can only tell you what I've seen and what my experience is. So if there's a true like master seamster that's been doing this for like 120 years and they're 140, I'm sorry. But I kind of think of lining as 2 different things. You have like a floating liner, and then you have a sewn in liner. So a sewn in liner basically is like how I have done it before, is doing like a double-sided piece of fabric, basically. So I don't know if that's a true liner, but that's normally how I think of it. Let's say you're making a backpack and you want the outside to be X-Pack, but you want the outside to be black X-Pack, but you want the inside to be something vibrant and bright, so that when you open it up, light can get in there and you can see what you're getting. That's a really common thing on EDC backpacks. Well, basically all you need to do is take those pattern pieces that you were going to make the backpack with and make identical pieces in the bright colored fabric that you want the inside to be, and sew those together and then treat them as one piece of fabric. That's the easiest way to get a different thing on the inside. Now, a floating liner involves some different methods that are going to be really hard to describe with words. But for the most part, you're creating like the shape of the inside of your bag. Then you're sewing it wrong side out to the perimeter of your bag and then flipping it right side when you put it inside the bag. And then oftentimes people will run a stitch around the perimeter to lock it into place. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the best way I can think of to describe it, is you're making like a shell, sewing it on inside out, and then stuffing it back inside the liner. And you would use a floating liner because, well, for a few reasons, but the main one is that you can flip it back out to clean the bag.
It's like an old-fashioned cooler. At least that's what I think about. Like when we'd go to the pool as a kid, my mom had a cooler that like it would get soaked and she would like pull it out to dry. Like you could just pull it out so that you can just like let it air out on its own and stuff.
Yeah. So hopefully that makes sense. That's the best, like I said, that's the best way I can give a tip on how to do that. I'm sure at some point we can make a video, no promises when that will be. But I think for a lot of people, just doing the method that I talked about, the first method, is probably enough for what you want. Usually you want to line something to add a visual or add durability or something like that. And you can do that by just basically making a double-sided fabric that you then just construct the bag as you were going to, rather than needing to make a new pattern or change your construction methodology to make true like standalone liner.
So in the question this person asked about the tote bag, what I would do there is do that technique that Carter's talking about, where you are just adding another material onto the pattern piece. So our tote bag comes laser cut so that it's all out in one big piece. I would get the fabric that you want to add on the inside, go wrong sides to wrong sides, baste that on with a stitch, and then cut that material down so they're now one big piece. With a tote bag, that's a really good example of doing that floating liner. And in that case, what I would do is I would probably make the tote bag, measure that out so to get the right circumference. Or you could, if you buy the tote bag pattern, you could copy that onto like a sil poly or whatever material you want to use on the inside, sew that, and then do that thing where you sew it around the perimeter, push it in. So that way it's like right sides out. So there's kind of, the tote bag's a good example because you can do it in both ways that you're talking about. But the kind of the basting on and making these two panel pieces become one panel piece, that's my favorite method. Right now, I mentioned earlier, making a bike bag. And that's sort of how I'm doing it, because I'm adding foam inserts it's like a rack bag. So I'm adding foam inserts for some stability. So that's the way that I'm doing it, is just adding two materials together so that I can add the foam inserts, and that's kind of becomes the lining in that case. But yeah, lining is a super fun technique to practice and to try out. With our DIY kits, there's a lot of really great ways to do it. Like if you want to make a ZPK kit, that's a really fun one to line, because you can have the outside be a fun material and the inside you can make sil poly, so it's easy to wipe out in case you, like I use mine as a, yeah.
If you accidentally urinate in your bag, you can clean it.
Or if your mouthwash opens up, or your face wash thing, the screw top breaks.
That you had to pee in because you were on a long road trip.
Yes, you got extremely desperate. But yeah, lining's really cool, so I'd recommend it. Well, that's it for the tips. That's all 10. I hope you took something out of this and you learned something new. Maybe we encourage you to go check out some new kits or some new materials. I really would. I think maybe the one thing I'd leave you guys is just try out new stuff. Try techniques, practice new things, do cool stuff with sewing, because it's a lot of fun. As always, please let us know what you think. Drop a comment on what tip was your favorite, or if you have other questions. This style of episode was kind of fun, so if you have other questions in the future, let us know. Maybe we'll do another one if this resonated with you.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone that helped us out by asking questions and submitting topics for us to talk about. We really appreciate you.
Big time appreciate you.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.